So, recording in progress. So this session, as I've just said, is being recorded. So therefore, and will be published later on the BSA's website. So therefore, in terms of housekeeping, I would like during the discussion that you ideally, so keep your camera switched off, or if you've got any comments, please feel free. So if to add them to the chat. I will monitor the chat in the background. And if you turn on your cameras, I should say, or have to say this, you would agree that, we have the right to use your image for the publication of this video later on the BSA's website. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm really, really pleased to have you all here, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Joanna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. One other technical point to add is if you wish to turn on live transcripts or to see the transcription on the side of the screen, we have enabled that setting, so they are at the bottom of the screen. So I couldn't be more excited to start my work as a convener of the BSA Theory Group by hosting an event with yourselves, Nathan and Femi. Thank you very much for being here. And today we will explore some of the lines of argument in the two books within the constraints of an hour. And so I've got here elite capture and solidarity in conflicts. Thank you all also for attending this event, especially on such a chaotic day in British politics. In any case, this event offers us a space and time to discuss politics and solidarity beyond, though not excluding, parliamentary and political party politics. So what I like about both books is their careful evaluation and analytical distinction between the practice and conceptualization of solidarity, democracy, conflict, identity politics, and elite capture, to then make the case for a kind of prefigurative politics of building the world anew. So in the words of the IWW trade union, building a new society within the shell of the old. So these two books are books about praxis. They offer very useful tools for analysis that would be of interest and use for social and political theorists, activists, sociologists, as well as anyone else who is interested in practicing productive solidarity and constructive politics. And in Femi's words from the book, but also I think this applies also to Solidarity in Conflict, these two books are for those who want a different and better world system than the one we have now. So please do read those two books and add them to your university library if you're affiliated to a university library. So I will start by asking questions for the next 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A with members of the audience. So just to start off, what motivated you both to write Elite Capture and Solidarity in Conflict, and what are the main conceptual distinctions highlighted in them? Nathan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So I was waiting to see who would go. I was really motivated to write this book because I started reading about like social and political theories of solidarity. And what I found in them just had no relationship to my own experiences of having been in solidarity organizations or having done any movement politics. Theories of solidarity often focus on fellow feelings or working together. And in fact, lots of them are written for people who are not members of solidarity organizations. So figuring out when people who aren't members should support people who are. And so I just think that that gave a really distorted view of this entire realm of social political activity that lots and lots of people are engaged in. And so the basic idea was, what would solidarity look like from the perspective of people who do it? And what kinds of useful things could we say about what this does for them, for a society, and for the people who aren't members of them?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I think my starting point is pretty similar to Nathan's, but a little bit different. It's similar in that I think we're both kind of responding to our experiences in movement politics and our perceptions of the kind of failure of theory to relate in a real and organic or sensible way to us, to how movement politics are actually going. But in my case, you know, I don't think it was so much of that theories about, in my case, identity politics and whether or not identity politics is good or bad were in every case totally disconnected from movement politics. I just didn't like what the connection was, right? Like, I think there's, you know, I mean, obviously there's right-wing and centrist criticisms of identity politics that maybe aren't coming from, you know, whatever is happening in the labor movement or the environmentalist movement or whatever. But there are left criticisms of identity politics that really seem to me to wanting to take left politics in a direction that I think we shouldn't go. So in my case, that's just to say, you know, I saw myself as participating in an ongoing conversation that really was rooted in movement politics, but is part of, you know, the kind of conflict that Nathan talks about in the book, right? You know, we're fighting over what our political spaces should be like, and so I'm just entering that ongoing fight with the book.
Excellent, thank you. And in Elite Capture and Solidarity in Conflict, you were both very careful and very explicit to highlight that you were not offering, so you were offering evaluative and non-moralistic accounts of politics and of struggle and the social sphere. And you explicitly avoided offering a how-to manual or a political program. So you kind of avoided the, in a way, moralism of liberal politics on the one hand, and the kind of centralized political program of revolutionary left parties. So I was just wondering, what was your motivation behind this decision of not being prescriptive in one of those two ways, especially given that your books are overtly political? What made you write them in such a way? Sorry, Nathan?
Oh.
Sorry, maybe Femi first.
Yeah, maybe we'll just take turns. So I'll just say a little bit first. I'm curious actually what Nathan has to say about it, given that it's, this kind of thing is pretty central to what he works on. But for me, I think that there's a certain kind of moralism that happens on the left, even by people who would otherwise position themselves as anti-moralists, who like substitute a criticism for something for an understanding of how that thing works. And so, you know, I mean, regardless of the question of whether or not we like identity politics, there's just the kind of descriptive sociological question of why it's taking the form that it's taking. And I think people have taken their criticisms of representation politics or identity politics, however it is that they understand it, and used that to stand in for a kind of ideology of why we have the sort of identity politics that we have. And so, yeah, the emphasis of the book on this kind of non-normative sort of technical explanation of identity politics was an attempt to resist that.
Yeah, I think that was part of my motivation as well, was to look at the ways that people criticize solidarity groups and participate in them and make those kinds of choices from a perspective that didn't highlight just like personal moral choices or personal intellectual views, was one of my goals. So there's this, I wouldn't want to endorse all of what Durkheim has to say on solidarity, but one of the things that he points out is that, you know, liberals are just interested in like individual moral questions about solidarity. And when you do that, you miss everything that's interesting about it. all of the problems, all of the questions, all the complications, they don't come from individual moral choices. They come from the fact that we're trying to do something together that's actually deeply difficult. And that means that we're all going to have to modify how we act and how we treat each other. And we're going to have to come to an agreement or work through our disagreements in order to do that. Once you have that view, it becomes kind of a performative contradiction to go around telling everyone how to do it, right? Like, who am I, the philosopher, to tell everyone how to solve all their movement problems, right? Like, that is their problem. I'll deal with it in the organizations I'm a member of. You deal with it in the organizations you're a member of. So long as we understand these disagreements are not because people are bad people, right? Like, one of the reasons we have these disagreements is because actually we really agree on some element of what needs to be done. Like, I don't go around just picking fights with people randomly who are doing things I disagree with. Like, I'm not at the grocery store, like standing in the meat aisle, being like, buddy, you got to put down that steak. Because like, I could, but there's no use in that kind of moralism. It's not going to get us anywhere. And it in fact detracts from the project of building something new together.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, Nathan, I remember you mentioned that in a way, had you been prescriptive, you would have been anti-democratic yourself. So that was one of the things that was quite interesting to see. And then Femi, you also made very clear what the difference is between the identity politics developed by the Combahee River Collective compared to the way in which identity politics is being treated nowadays. And we might be looking back into this area of argument in a bit. So thank you. Next, a commonality between the lines of argument in the two books is your critique of a differential and individual approach to politics and solidarity. Hence also the title of this event. So Femi's book focuses on those who are structurally well-positioned, deferring to those relatively marginalized, but who are still within the same room, within the same space. And Nathan's book touches on, I think, two types of deference, if not more, as well as Femi, there might be just more than just one, but from what I picked up. So in Nathan's book, there is the deference of those who aren't part of activist group, but who want to stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized. And it's kind of like a one-way kind of relationship. And alongside that, there is also a general deference to those who benefit from the psychological wage of whiteness. So in light of these things, what would you say are the implications of university workers and students taking a differential approach to politics in the contemporary context of higher education as a site of knowledge production and social reproduction?
So the things that I have seen that I would sort of diagnose as like pathological outcomes of this kind of deferential approach is that I see in my students a lot of unwillingness to actually engage with intellectual ideas from traditions that they don't share the identity of. So when I teach something from like the Black radical tradition, not a lot of white students will participate in thinking about it, or at least collectively talking about it. And it strikes me that there's a real loss there for them to work out those ideas and their thoughts on those ideas. But there's also a kind of, I don't know the exact word I would want to put on it, something like, it seems to me a bit condescending almost to think like I shouldn't engage with this text just in an intellectual fashion, the same way I would engage any text in an intellectual fashion. because it's like, we're here to engage these ideas. And the idea that you can't engage Black thought because you're white actually strikes me as a real problem, like for their personal growth, but also in general, academically. It seems like that kind of deference can turn quickly into like a kind of condescension almost, where it's like, well, I can't go around speaking negatively about this person's ideas because they're Black. And it's like, well, that's really not going to get us anywhere. Like, let's treat this intellectually.
Right. I might even say something stronger. I feel like that kind of deference is already there. It's already at condescension, right? It views, it's a kind of doxastic reparations where like my belief in the thing that you're saying is supposed to be, a transfer of some kind to you. And, don't get me wrong. I think people who practice deference politics also think that we should do other things for marginalized groups other than believe in and advocate the theories or perspectives that some people from the marginalized groups might produce. But you can already see how in practice, this is going to end up being a substitute for the kind of political action that would much more importantly, in my view, address marginalization and racial oppression and, everything else that comes with those things. So yeah, I mean, I agree, but I would go even further, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. Nathan, when you were speaking earlier, I was thinking that in a way it's like an abdication of responsibility, not to become engaged in these discussions and not to think about your own role within racial capitalism as a white person or as a human being on this planet. And yeah, so I was wondering, are you aware of any particular projects within, outside, or beyond the university that are now emerging, or that you've come across that are trying to go beyond these traps, to get out of these traps of deference? Or if not, are there particular historical examples? Femi, would you like?
I'll say a couple. So I think there are tons of things people are doing in and around the university that goes beyond deference. One example that's in the book is the response of researchers to the Flint water crisis. So, I take it we all know the basics, but the city of Flint had contaminated water. The state of Michigan, which is where the city of Flint is, they dispatched scientists to say the water was fine. And so the residents of Flint had to prove otherwise. So they did some citizen science. They got their neighbors to test the water, collaborating with researchers at a children's hospital and Virginia Tech, which Virginia Tech is the university. And so that's an example of something that goes beyond deference politics. Obviously, it involves listening to people who say, hey, my water is visibly contaminated, but it goes beyond just hearing what they have to say and makes available the resources of the university to actually do something about it. I think that's plenty. That's a good example of the kind of thing, but that's by no means a unique example. This is something that happens at small scales a lot, actually.
Yeah, I would say in terms of like thinking beyond the university and its involvement, there are so many social movements that in fact don't center this kind of deference. And I would say like climate action would be one of them. Like there are one of the reasons I think that it doesn't get so involved in this kind of deference politics is, first of all, we're all affected differentially, obviously, based on our like world location, our political location, et cetera. But part of it also has to do with the fact that there are so many groups organizing climate action. And when you have all these different groups doing it, if you don't agree with what someone is doing, you can just move to a different group and participate in their action. And so there's really a sense where when you have a lively, active, like set of social organizations about an issue, you never really need to just find someone to defer to, because you can probably find a group who agrees with either your goal or your tactic. And so, like, if you don't want to throw soup on the Van Gogh, find a different organization and like put some rocks in SUVs, little tire pressure things, and flatten all their tires, right? You've got a lot of options. And because there are more options, there's less of a need to find someone and say, okay, you're the person who's really knowledgeable and we need to do what you say.
Thank you. It's like they focus on the outcome rather than the process, or like what's going on internally. Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, following on from this point about activist groups, both Elite Capture and Solidarity in Conflict were written from a materialist perspective of rank and file organizers and scholars who have been directly and practically involved in political and solidarity groups. And I could identify so much of what you've both written in these books by thinking about my own past participation in solidarity groups. And I also noticed that those two books stressed just how hard and demanding this work of solidarity and constructive politics is, and why it's so important. So I was wondering, what particular theoretical insights has your experience of organizing given you as scholars when you wrote those two books, compared to, say, if you were to have written them as if you were detached observers, as many other scholars do? Whoever wants to start first.
I think I'm up first. For me, what I really took from my own experiences of solidarity organizing and the experiences of other people I know involved in movement politics in different organizations than me, was just that my experience of this as something that's really difficult, like personally, and requires personal change in the way that I see myself and think about myself and the types of things I do, that helped me to see that, like, solidarity is not just some action, right? That there's more involved in what this can do for a world than just the specific outcome it seeks, right? Like, I'm a significantly different person. I see the world in a different way. And that's all thanks to other people I have organized with. And so thinking about that, I really started to understand, like, the transformative possibilities of like activist politics or movement politics aren't just winning a world, but it's also changing ourselves, right? Becoming the kind of thing that could live in that world, rather than the kind of thing fit to live in this damaged, really shitty world. Because that also is work that needs to be done. And we do it together by participating in these kinds of movements and holding each other to task, having these kinds of debates and arguments and conflicts with each other. We become radically different ourselves in the process of making the world different as well.
I totally agree with that. But I think the thing that I would add is one of the things that I learned from, I think maybe the deepest theoretical insight that I got from doing organizing was how marginal of a role theoretical insights play. I think it's very difficult, it's very difficult to appreciate how, and I don't want to overcorrect in the anti-intellectual way that it just doesn't matter how we think about the world, right? How we think about the world plays into what our objectives even are in the first place, much less how it is that we get to them. But, it's a far cry from the kinds of things that you see in book clubs or on social media where people have these drag out fights about, whether the proper way of conceptualizing the role of the working class is as, discussed by this thinker or that thinker. And I'm like, honestly, the success or failure of your political campaign is much more dramatically tied to the question of whether you remembered to bring chips than to the question of whether Mao or Gonzalo has the right picture of revolutionary change. That is just how the world works, as far as my experience has told me. And so I think that's something that I tried a lot in Elite Capture to reflect. Like, there's a lot of people, I talk about a lot of historical examples in the book, and they're historical examples of people whose thought I take seriously. But a lot of the thought that I'm taking seriously is how did they respond to the practical impediments to them trying to do the thing they were trying to do? Not like, what was their deep account of Spinoza's ontology or whatever, like practical questions. How is it that we do the stuff? And that's where we should put our thinking caps on. And there are a lot of theoretical questions to ask about those things once we have been, once we're appropriately centering, for lack of a better term, the actual practical things that we're trying to accomplish. That's where I end the book, kind of like Nathan was saying earlier. It's not about coming up with a particular program because the world is too complex and I don't know the particulars of that person's situation versus that person's situation. But, what is the mindset where we would even be able to, in a good position to find out what we could do in this situation or that situation? I think it's the one where we let our practical context do a lot of the dictating of what we find theoretically important.
Thank you. Femi, you mentioned a series of names of those whom you've referenced in your book, and I would like to ask a question about that. So in your book, you make reference to the life stories and the theories and political outlook of practitioners of constructive politics, or perhaps Nathan would call them practitioners of solidarity. So you talk about Paulo Freire, Amilcar Cabral, Carter Woodson, Lily Cabral, the Combahee River Collective, the residents of Flint, Michigan, and so on. And I was just wondering, what can we learn from their approaches to contestation and solidarity?
I think and hope that there's a lot that we can learn. The biggest through line is just what I got done is just what I just got done saying. So all those people, especially the kind of first figures that I talked about, Carter G. Woodson, E. Franklin Frazier, those people aren't, they weren't Marxist-Leninists like Lili Cabral and Amilcar Cabral and people that I talk about later in the book are, and even amongst the people who you might think of as radical left in orthodox senses, there's a lot of theoretical disagreement. There's a lot of political disagreement between the figures that I talk about, but all of them, went from high level theoretical questions about what the world was like to actual practical tasks. Even the most quote unquote liberal of them, Carter G. Woodson, who I think a lot of people would think of as would think of dismissively as like insufficiently radical, you know, he thought that it was more than just fighting off incorrect racist conclusions about history, which is the kind of practical thing that he started off trying to do by studying history. He thought we need to actually change how history is taught. We need to build a whole different information infrastructure. And so he had cultural events, and he built a African-American historical society outside of, or on the kind of outside of, but slightly in, no, I should just say outside of the university system, right? For people to participate in who weren't necessarily getting degrees. And so even he thought that the output of these theoretical conclusions that he came to about how miseducation worked was to actually build an education system that was different rather than just critique the existing education system. So, you know, the through line between them is that the output of criticism should be action rather than more preening criticism. So that's one thing that we can take from them. But I think there's something more, especially in the case of Lilika Boal. So when she and her fellow revolutionaries were setting up a pilot school, they were committed to a couple things that I think are learning from, or are worth learning from. Actually, three things. One was to find a way to make that pilot school practically compatible with the ecosystem it was fitting into. In particular, the children were also farm workers, because that's how life was literally sustainable in this part of the world. And so they had to make the actual calendar of school compatible with the agricultural calendar. The second Lilika Boal did was, and her fellow revolutionaries did, was a robust commitment to internationalism and to and to finding resources wherever they could. Sweden, Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, Guinea-Conakry, all of these countries had leaders that funneled resources in their direction, and it's hard to see how they could have succeeded without it. And the third thing that I think is worth really pulling out of Lilika Boal and the pilot school is the importance of a kind of practice first way of deciding what it is that's going to be taught, deciding what it is based on utility. So they taught the students in Portuguese, not because they failed to sufficiently decolonize themselves from the mindset of the Portuguese Empire who they were fighting. No, they were very aware of what their relationship to the Portuguese Empire was, but they were also aware of how it would be that they would make the children learning in the school able to get knowledge from elsewhere. There is a lot more science and history and art that was available in Portuguese than was available in Creole, or the Cape Verdean Creole, or the Bissau Guinean Creole, that was available in Balanche or any of the languages that the students might have spoken at home. And it also solved the problem of, if you teach one particular ethnic language, then the people from that ethnic group might, it might play badly into power dynamics. So it solved a number of political and epistemic problems that they had. And that was more important to them than the aesthetics of rejecting the colonial language in order to prove your decolonial bona fides. So all of these areas of focus are things that I hope we can learn from Lilika Boal and the pilot school.
Thank you. In your book, you talked about coalitional politics and constructive politics, and then these are some of the elements that Lilika Boal really adopted. Now, I'm conscious of the time. It's 43 past. I have a question for Nathan, because I was thinking of asking kind of individual questions as well. I will pose it, but the audience, if you wish to pose any questions to the speakers, please start writing them and thinking about them now, and then we will read them out in a few minutes. So, Nathan, in your book, you make a distinction between social and antisocial solidarity groups. So the former seek to eliminate exclusion in order to achieve liberation, whereas the latter seek to deepen exclusion and domination. And you also argue that conflict that takes place within social solidarity groups is productive and democratic and integral to the reproduction of these groups and their strategic goals, which is a very, very intriguing point that I was very excited to explore. So in light of this, it has made me wonder, what role does the process of elite capture play in relation to conflict in solidarity, either theoretically or practically?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Femi gets at with the idea of elite capture was saying something that I had been like working my way around without ever directly addressing, right? So in the book, I give a few examples of elite capture effectively without calling it that. Simply because he hadn't written the book yet. Maybe he had written it, but I hadn't read it. And so one of them is, right, there are persistent problems with criticism of leadership of solidarity organizations, that when people become too deferential to leadership, problems happen, right? So Rosa Luxemburg blames the leadership for the failure of the revolution, right? So she actually is like, yeah, I'm gonna get killed because you failed all of us. And that strikes me as a pretty good example of elite capture, right? You have this group who's decided to direct a revolutionary force that they're not necessarily a part of, and sort of throwing the members who have followed in the footsteps to the wolves once it fails, right? So they have benefited in some way through being leadership and have harmed all the other members and harmed the cause in general. But there are other examples of it insofar as who gets to be a member of the solidarity group is decided. So I thought about this politically in terms of like a democratic boundary problem. So like, who gets to be a member of the polity and gets to participate in the construction of the goals of a political organization, and who has to be excluded? Often that gets constituted based on pre-existing structures of power rather than anything else. So when you see those exclusions, they tend to fall along the same lines that other forms of minoritization and social exclusion or domination occur. And I think one name and one way that process happens is the process of elite capture. So you end up with fewer, more minoritized or more excluded members of a society involved in an organization because they've been alienated by the process of what the organization's goals have become about these kinds of high level problems that a very few members of the group have. And so the majority of the members of that group are just like sort of shunted to the side. And so it sort of is one way that those kinds of exclusions can happen, I think.
Thank you. And that's perhaps also how some solidarity groups turn from social into antisocial potentially. Thank you very much. Now,
Joanna, I'm conscious of time. So
yes.
I was wondering, I mean, I don't mean to be disruptive to like this really lively and excellent discussion, but I was wondering if you could also open the floor to the public, and anybody who would like to ask any questions for our two speakers today, so if you could ask them. like I said before, so in case anybody joined a bit later, if you do want to ask a question and unmute yourself and use your video, please do note this is being recorded. Otherwise, if you don't feel comfortable using your image, then please feel free to put a question into the chat. Okay, so if you've got any questions for our two speakers today, over to you. Okay, I see there's
one question in the chat.
Yes, so Nick has a question for us. So he's asking, do either of your conceptions of solidarity extend beyond the human? I'm thinking about campaigns in support of animal rights, plant rights, and the physical environment, including the climate. Any thoughts on how this might alter strategies of solidarity? Who wants to go first?
I can say something quickly. I definitely think, for me, the conception of solidarity extends beyond the human. And in fact, I think the view that I'm trying to come towards is a sort of ecological view of solidarity. I don't use the term solidarity quite as much as Nathan does, but I imagine, you could think of a economic culture of relentless extraction as a sort of failure of solidarity. And you could look at sustainability, or whatever we'd like to call, the eco-socialist utopia that hopefully we're constructing, or whatever, but whatever we want to call the better thing, the better way of living, producing, relating to the world in general, and all of the creatures in it, not just human ones. I feel like that would be an ecology of solidarity. So it would be a sort of factive thing about the kind of social structure that we build inside of and relating to nature and the world around us.
Yeah, so I think that I agree. I'm not trying to build an ecological theory so much as a theory that includes in some way ecological considerations. So one example I have in mind of this being really successful, really successful is a relative term, I suppose, is the modification of Ecuador's constitution to include rights of nature. The organization to do something like that strikes me as in some way solidarity on behalf of the planet. It's an attempt to restore to nature what it should have, that we have taken unjustifiably. But I also think there's this sort of difficult question to me about what it really does mean to be in solidarity with other animals or with other creatures on the planet. It raises these difficult problems, specifically because no one who is an other animal can articulate for us what that would look like. And so in some way, we're all kind of outsiders in that sense. The only thing that we have, I think, that gives us contact specifically with other animals is solidarity and vulnerability, physical bodily vulnerability and the suffering that we can be subjected to. And we spend a lot of time trying not to focus on that feature of ourselves. What it is to be a person often means getting rid of those things. And so cultivating solidarity with other animals, I think we can do. And I think part of that has to be a difficult process of figuring out what it means for us to be the kind of vulnerable creatures that we are, and how that relates to the vulnerability of all of the other creatures on the planet.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Femi, for answering that question. Are there any other questions people would like to ask? Okay, there's one also slightly longer one. So Jacob is asking a practical question. I'm a social movement organization that was started by a young white graduate activist, but has ambition to be led by working class people and people of color. So we ran a 5-year strategizing process, and this desire to be led by diverse members led to most of the founders and long-term strategy thinkers not being in the room because they were white graduates. The people in the room were more diverse, but very inexperienced at strategic thinking for the organization. While I want these people to be trained in strategic thinking, they aren't there yet, and as a result, strategy is formed only slowly with events overtake us. This seems unfortunate to me when we have some great strategic thinkers, not me. But a white man myself, I worry that it sounds like whining about the effacement of my own position to raise this. So what sort of language can I use to talk about this? I feel I really like a language that won't sound reactionary, or am I being reactionary? Who wants to go first?
I mean, I guess I can say like my general thoughts. So I think it's interesting that you would ask Femi and I this, two people who are like, we cannot tell you what to do. Like we wrote whole books that were just like, we're not going to tell you what to do. And now you're like, no, but tell us what to do. So I will hesitantly do that. I think the first question that I would ask myself is, what is the interest in having the organization led by working class people and people of color? And why is that so important to the group? So it seems to me like, dependent on what the group's goals are, if you have good strategic thinkers, let them do the strategic thinking. Like, what, isn't it more important to achieve the goal of the organization than to have necessarily the right people doing the thinking? Because that, to me, like, in my opinion, the right people to do the thinking are the ones who can figure out how to get what you want. And if what you want is a diverse organization with people of color leading it, then yeah, train them in strategic thinking. But if what you want is a separate goal, figure out who can help you get to that and work together to get it, would be my advice, I guess.
Yeah, I want to co-sign a couple things Nathan said. One being that, we're not the people that know how to navigate every organization, and that's not what we build ourselves at. So I think that's an important caveat to start. But in the interest of like making good faith effort to answer the question, the language that I would use to talk about this is deference politics. Right. This just seems like a pretty clear case of that. And I think the kind of line of questioning that Nathan was pushing just now helps show that, right? If the goal, the only goal of the organization that you gave us information about is to be led by working class people and people of color. So if you're being led by working class people and people of color, congrats, you won, right? Like you're there, you have achieved your goal. And the question about whether those people are good at strategic thinking or not is really neither here nor there. But on the other hand, if you have goals besides being led by working class people and people of color, then again, as Nathan said, the question is, what are those? Are those actually the primary thing that you started off trying to achieve? And if those were the primary thing you were trying to achieve, why aren't they anymore? Because, if you just want to, say this is about combating evictions, let's say, then that's your standard of success, right? If people get to stay where they're living, you're winning. If people are getting evicted, you're losing. And putting And those are the interests you should be centering. And obviously, it's good for the people who end up in leadership positions if that's what they want. I think that's a very strange thing to want, but let me not. That's a whole other conversation. But if that's, you know, if people just really want to be in charge of shit just to be in charge, then that small group of working class people and people of color are winning by you putting them in a leadership position. But none of the tenants who are trying to avoid eviction are winning if that's the only thing you've accomplished. So all that's a really just rambling way of plus ones to what Nathan said. But I'll stop there.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So I've just seen, so there was a brief comment for Veronica. Unfortunately, she has to dash off a bit earlier, but she made a very good comment that, in case anybody wasn't convinced by the books we've mentioned at the very beginning, I hope you're convinced by now. So let me put them back here in the chat. So I'm conscious of time. It's now 4 o'clock on our end, which is the time we've planned for today's event. So I wondered, is there any other very urgent question, a very brief one, any short one, anybody would like to ask? Otherwise, I'd like to thank our speakers for today's session. Any urgent questions? Okay, it really looks like Femi and Nathan, you've really answered all the questions that are currently out there. I really enjoyed today's discussion. It was so lively, so much stuff to think about. So really, hopefully, other people will dig into these books and read into them. So I think there's a lot to gain from today's debate, and I'd like to thank everybody who attended today and for their questions. And like I said, this question will be recorded. So what we're going to do later on is the video will be put up on the BSA's website. So in case you couldn't make it today, or you would like to use this for your teachings or further research, we will then send out the message via our list and Twitter about it once the video becomes available. So again, Nathan, Femi, thank you so much, for attending today's event. And Joanna, thanks so much for asking all these really insightful, interesting questions. It was really a pleasure having you all here. So thank you very much. Thank you. Bye, everyone.